Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the 2 men who stood with him, just as they were leaving him. Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one about any of the things they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated. Sorry if I threw you a curveball there. That was the optional, quicker ending. So, grace, peace, and love to you from God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I hope you noticed that there is a lot of glowing going on in the lessons for today. In our Old Testament lesson, we have Moses descending from Mount Sinai with his face glowing after he had conversations probably with God up on the mount. And Moses, of course, returns with the tablets of the covenant in hand. In our gospel lesson, we have the story of Jesus' transfiguration. And there Luke tells us that Jesus and a select group of his disciples went up on some unnamed mountain. And there, not only Jesus' face, but his entire body, even his clothes, began to glow. And as the disciples looked on, a glowing Moses and Elijah joined Jesus. This may be stating the obvious, but I think the reason for all this glowing is that it signifies God's presence. Of course, Moses dealt directly with God on Mount Sinai, and that encounter left him glowing. And in our gospel, remember, Jesus is 100% God and 100% human. But it would have been odd for a human to walk around constantly glowing, and so a few disciples got a glimpse of Jesus' glow and glory this one time. So today is Transfiguration Sunday, but it's also considered the last Sunday of or after the Epiphany, the season that considers who God is and how God reveals God's self to us, his people. And from our Old Testament lesson, we learn that God is so powerful, so majestic, so holy, that when someone comes into the presence of God, namely Moses, that some of that holiness rubs off and you begin to glow. Your physical manifestation, there's a physical manifestation of that encounter. But even before that, remember that Moses, in his first encounter with God, encountered a burning bush. And there was this question that Moses had about God's identity. Moses asked God, if the people, the Israelites, asked who, or the Hebrews at that point, I guess, asked who sends me, what should I tell them? And God says to Moses, tell them I am. Well, if Moses was worried about whether the people believed him or not, about God sending him, he didn't have to worry about that any longer, right? His very appearance was proof that he had encountered the holy, that he had dealt with God. So God took that concern of Moses entirely out of Moses' hands and handled his own credentialing in Moses' countenance. This question of divine identity is also a concern in our gospel lesson to those who follow Jesus, both the disciples who followed Jesus closely and also to those other followers who kind of followed at a greater distance. But of course, those who witnessed Jesus' glow are fewer in number than those who witnessed Moses' glow. Luke even goes so far as to tell us that those who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration, his glowing, didn't say anything about it until later. And presumably by later they meant following the first Pentecost. But for the few who were there on Transfiguration Mountain, their eyes were opened. And this mountain experience was a stunning moment of revelation for them. The veil was pulled back and they saw the glory of God in the person of Jesus. They saw Jesus was indeed the Messiah. Presumably that transfiguration glow helped those who saw it figure out the question of identity. Just who is this Jesus? This was the question on the minds of many in Jesus' day. And if we're honest with ourselves, hopefully, it crosses our minds as well as we gather for church or for study of some kind, either personal or corporate. Because the Gospels should force us to ask that question on a regular basis as the Gospel reveals Jesus' action. Who is this individual? Who is this person that is God incarnate, who comes to us? And why did he do the things that he did? Why did he say the things that he did? And so on. Those questions should stir in us. As we meet Jesus each time that we gather to hear his word and share his meal, that should be a question. Who is Jesus? And down through the centuries, scholars have sought him in ancient texts. Archaeologists have also launched other quests for the historical Jesus, all with the idea of answering that question. Who is Jesus? They hope through archaeology and history to uncover who Jesus really was and is. Even Jesus' contemporaries, his own disciples, asked in Mark's gospel, who is this person that even the wind and the sea obey him? Still, history is stingy when it comes to new historical evidence of Jesus' identity. What documentary evidence we've had for a good while now. So we're still left with that question, who is this Jesus? And even though we may be tempted to think, well, this whole question of the true identity of Jesus, it must have been solved for those who were there at the Transfiguration. After all, Jesus is dramatically transfigured before them. The cloud, the dazzling white garments, all biblical ways of describing this very transcendent moment. For a moment on the mountain, the veil is pulled back, and the disciples witnessed the glory of Jesus, of God in Jesus. This is my son. Listen to him. They even heard the voice of God. It's such a momentous event that Peter, overcome by the glory of it all, wants to launch into a building project. Clearly, this is a moment that Peter wants to preserve. But while Peter wants to stay up on the mountain and build these houses for Jesus and Moses and Elijah, Jesus is ready to be on his way. Because this mountain is not his destination, it's merely a moment on his journey. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. and more specifically to another mountain, Golgotha. And on that very different mountain, his once dazzling white robes will be soaked in blood. There will be no divine voice, no cloud, no dazzling light. Today's time on the mountain is but a detour from the main journey that Jesus is on toward the cross. And thus we have here a story about a peculiar way Jesus combines his glory and his shame, the spiritual high of the transfiguration with the cruel degradation of the cross. For on these very different mountains, the one revealed to be the Son of God will be crucified. Who is Jesus? The voice says, not only this is my beloved Son, but listen to him. But are we ready to listen? Are we ready to hear when Jesus says, I'm the one who descends from the glory of the mountain to the degradation of the valley. Come, take up your cross and follow me. Yes. On this Sunday, we stand on the threshold of Lent, that 40-day journey toward the cross with Jesus. On the way, before the journey's end, there will be opposition, betrayal, resistance, cruelty, and ultimately death. Are we willing to listen to that Jesus for the next 40 days? Are we willing to be led with him down the glorious mountain top into the valley of the shadow of death? Who is Jesus? I think we actually know the answer to that question. But our problem is that we too have been to the mountaintop. We've heard the voice, we've seen the glory, and we're just not that sure if we have the guts to follow from Gethsemane to Golgotha, from Bethlehem to Calvary. I want Jesus to be the one who rescues me from evil, and yet he turns out to be the one who leads me directly into confrontation with evil. Like Jesus and Moses before him, when we follow, we must come off the mountain, and we have to return to the valley of shadows and death. That should not be a surprise to us. Recall how our gospel began this morning. First words are, now about 8 days after those sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and they went up a mountain to pray. First couple words, 8 days after these sayings. What sayings? What words? What were the disciples living with and thinking about for over a week now? If we look back at chapter 9, verse 18, we see that Jesus is alone with his disciples. And we're back to that whole identity question again. As Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? Well, some say that you're John the Baptist come back to life. Other people say that you've re-inhabited the body of Elijah. And other people say that you're one of the old prophets arisen from the dead. Then Jesus looks at the 12 and asks them, well, what do you say? Who do you say that I am? And not missing a beat, Peter, of course, says, you are the Messiah of God. Good answer, Peter. Jesus then makes one of his first pronouncement, that he will have to undergo great suffering, be rejected, killed, and then raised on the third day. And he says, if any of you want to be my followers, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Can you imagine how that news hit the disciples? Probably like a ton of bricks. Remember, this was the first time that they were hearing this news of what Jesus would have to undergo. And I imagine they must have thought, wait, I don't think I heard you right. You're the Messiah. You're supposed to be the one to come and set things right. You're supposed to restore the glory that was ours under David. And now you're telling me that you are going to be killed as a common criminal? And that you expect us to follow you into that suffering and death? And then imagine, for 8 days, the disciples had to live with these questions. They had to stew in their minds, mulling them over. For 8 days, these words went against the grain of their expectations. For 8 days, they had to wonder if this was what God really intended for them. And now it was about 8 days after those sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, went up a mountain to pray. While Jesus was praying, his face changed. His face and clothes became a dazzling white. And then Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the prophet, stood beside him. And it was glorious, like a dream, like a vision. This is what the Messiah was supposed to look like. And as Elijah and Moses were just about to depart, it's Peter who cries out, wait, don't go. This is just how I imagined it. You see, this is the kind of Messiah that Peter and everyone else wants. Powerful, transcendent, full of glory and authority. No more of this messy talk about crosses and death and rejection. This is the path. This is the place. This is the kind of God that Peter and you and I would love to follow. However, the Transfiguration is only a momentary gift and assurance that Jesus is Lord. It provides Peter and John and James and all of us a glimpse, even if only momentarily, of Christ's glory. But the power and glory of God is not found in all that glitters and is filled with glory and light, but in the shadows of human need. In those moments when God seems most distant, on the cross, where Jesus will be so vulnerable and God will appear to be absent. I wonder if that's how the people of Ukraine feel today. Where it appears that the entire world is sitting on the sidelines and watching, not doing anything, but watching. As bad, big Russia has its way with little Ukraine. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should go to war. I'm not saying NATO should get involved in the shooting match between Russia and the Ukraine. But I don't know about you, but I feel awful empty just kind of standing by, listening to news reports as the war unfolds. And it seems like the bully Russia is beating up on poor little Ukraine. Just another reminder that this place is not the mountains, but that we're called to follow Jesus down the mountain into the way of denial and daily taking up our crosses. It's a lot like worship. Our worship each week shouldn't be an escape or retreat from the world. It should instead be a springboard for us to jump into the world. Back to family, back to work, to school. Be ready to be the people of God, ready to declare his presence even in the shadow of human need, ready to proclaim the love of Jesus Christ in the midst of sin, death, and the power of the devil. This is the good news of Jesus. The time has come, not to the mountaintop. God has come, not to the mountaintop, but to sanctify every human life in the deepest and darkest valleys. Our encounter with God does not take us out of the world, but actually leads us deeper into its heart, into the place of human need, so that we too can walk in the way of the cross. That's the challenge that's posed to us today in the Transfiguration. There's that momentary glory, transfiguration of Jesus, where he glows. But ultimately, he must go down the mountain, where he invites us to follow. Thanks be to God. Amen.